With us today is Rebecca Power. She is Director of the North Central Region Water Network, University of Wisconsin. She's going to be talking today strategies for getting to scale, expanding successful approaches for new watersheds. Rebecca, Water Resource Specialist with the University of Wisconsin Extension. As I mentioned, Director of the North Central Region Water Network, provides leadership and national training for conservation professionals. So please welcome Rebecca.
Hello, everybody. How are you today? Good. Woo, good. And everybody can hear me okay? That's good. Good to see some familiar faces out there, and good to see some new faces too. So how many of you feel like you are a part of or have been a part of a successful watershed management project? Couple, yeah, couple, yeah, all right. But there are some out there, right? So about 20, maybe 20% of the room, 10% of the room. Well, what we want to try to do is get to 100% eventually, right? And even if we know it's going to take us a while. It took us a long time to get here. It's going to take us a while to get to that 100% vision. I'm still hopeful. But how do we do that? How do we go from these small scale successes, where we have been able to cobble together enough resources, we have great farmers, great scientists, great educators, that mix of people, great agency folks, great private sector partners, as Sean and others were talking about. How do we get that mix to scale up? So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, and just to maybe shift your thinking a little bit about how to approach this issue. And a number of you have been working on this for a long time. Some of you have participated in conversations that have contributed to these ideas, and I want to thank you in advance for that. But what I wanted to start out with, as a Wisconsin person, I wanted to start out appreciating the beauty and value of Iowa's water resources. I spend a lot of time, and I'm sure you all do too, talking about what's wrong. But I hope you are all getting out there and enjoying some of the exquisite scenery and values that water and soil are providing. So I wanted to start there. And then, of course, these are the things that, I spend more time talking about. Harmful algal blooms in Wisconsin. We have a lot of dairy cows that are still in our streams, not so fun. Fish kills, those algae blooms can be toxic. And then, protecting our drinking water, not only in the big cities, but also for those of us living in rural areas and relying on those wells for the water for our families and for our livestock. So, these are, we heard about ecosystem services this morning and in other presentations. So we want to acknowledge this, the values that water provides and the challenges that we're facing in keeping those ecosystem services. And you all are ground zero for a lot of these conversations on state nutrient strategies. You have a great science assessment that many of us look to as an example of how we, say, okay, this is what we've got as our system. This is where we need to get the job done. Boy, that's a giant gap. Okay, now what? So we have these these big picture basin goals as well as goals for Iowa. These slides are from Dr. Matt Helmers, that I'm sure a number of you know well. Just pointing out for Iowa, Illinois, for most of the states, all of the states in the basin, what a significant land use challenge and financial challenge that we're facing when it comes to getting to scale. So the way I'm going to frame that challenge today is like this. How do we get to the level of implementation that we need to appreciably move the needle on reducing nutrient loss to surface and groundwater, So I'm going to specifically focus on nutrients today and how do we eliminate water impairments while maintaining other ecosystem services. So looking at how nutrients are excess nutrients and nutrient loss and from the places that we want it are getting in the way of these ecosystem services that we would like to maintain. All right, and I already framed the getting to scale issue a little bit for you. So I'm going to talk about what is successful watershed management, what do we know about getting to scale, and my presentation, I hope, complements Sean's previous presentation. He really focused on conservation infrastructure and getting more private sector engagement in how we do conservation. That's a portion of what I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to try to put it in a bigger context. And what Sean was talking about, I think, is a really important chunk of how we get this done. So that's where this theory of change comes in. So what is our idea of how we get from point A to point B? And that's our theory of how we think it's going to work, right? So we've got to be, one of the points I'm going to make is we've got to be really clear on what that is, and that we can see some commonalities across states that are dealing with the same issue that we are. And what we've tried to do is harvest some of those commonalities, figure out what the common elements are, those necessary elements of successful watershed management that we see consistently working in these small scale successes, and then how do we grow those across the landscape. Okay, so who doesn't know what the watershed approach is? Who doesn't know that? And that's why you're here, right? So, but just to clarify, we want to take a systems approach. We want watersheds to be the primary analytical unit. We use other boundaries, county boundaries, our state boundaries, other kinds of boundaries for other reasons. But for this particular purpose, we want to focus on watersheds. We know that there are multiple scales we have involved here, all the way from the small 12-digit or even sub-12-digit level, all the way up to the Mississippi River Basin. And those have to be, those scales have to be taken into account when we think about how to manage. It takes everybody, right? So multi-organizational coordination and participation. We want our decisions to be based on science. And I would also say a lot of wisdom in the field. I mean, there's so much wisdom and experience that science does not capture, so we want to couple those two very broad categories of knowledge in figuring out how to move forward. And then finally, we want to maintain enough flexibility to adapt as we learn, right? One of the places I think we've gotten into trouble with regulations is when they are too rigid for us to be able to learn and adapt, right? So regulations serve an important purpose. They help keep us all safe and allow us to live together as people, but they can get in the way of change also. So we want to maintain that ability to adapt. All right. So what do we know about getting to scale from other sectors, particularly, where do people get their hair cut? Who gets their hair cut at a Great Clips or a Cost Cutters or some kind of chain? Okay, yep, so, all right. Who has ever been to a Subway? All right. Starbucks? Who's from Starbucks? Okay, all right. Who has never been to a franchise of any sort? All right, good. All right, there you go. So these are highly successful examples of how in the private sector we've taken the mom and pop hamburger joint, right, and turned it into McDonald's or Wendy's or Burger King, whatever, right? So those franchises have got some things to teach us about getting to scale. As well as multi-scale NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, that's the best one I'll use because they really have done a great job at that multi-scale presence. So what do they have to teach us? They leverage their knowledge of what a successful system looks like and successful adaptation strategies. So, once you have that down for one, you can spread that around. Increase attractiveness to investors and customers. You know what you're getting, and you know it's successful, and you know what you're getting. So that makes it more likely for you to go as a customer, and also helps attract those private sector investors that John was talking about. And then finally, they can share administrative resources, right? So you all know if you're a watershed coordinator or you've worked in a watershed, there's a lot of administrative tasks, a lot of, what we learn about monitoring. There's a lot of stuff to learn, and boy, does it help, or the marketing part or the outreach part, to be able to have support services that are common across watersheds or the units, that really helps. So these are just some key points to think about getting to what they've taught us. So the path to success for this getting to scale that NGOs and private sector franchises have taught us. First, we have to identify what the consistent elements are of our theory of change. What makes a McDonald's a McDonald's? What makes a Starbucks a Starbucks? What makes the Nature Conservancy the Nature Conservancy? Or pick your organization. What are those? And what is their? And for those private sector businesses, they're trying to get you to buy something, right? That's the change that we're looking for. So our job is a little bit more complex, which I'll get to in a minute. But so they had to, design their, figure out what their theory of change is, design, and then figure out how to replicate that model. So growth strategy, designing the network, how are those units connected? And then determining the role of the network founders. So how do they ensure that consistency and those things that investors are looking for are maintained, facilitating learning across the unit, so a rising tide lifts all boats, that kind of thing. And then providing those central services that I had mentioned earlier. All right. So a model that is maybe a little bit more consistent with what we're trying to do in watershed management, public health sector has been ahead of us, in the environment or conservation sector for a while on a number of different things. Behavior change being a big one, and then looking at scaling up. Their research is ahead of ours. So what they have learned in looking at efforts to scale up public health interventions, you figure out what the best practices are and say, hey, okay, this is an opportunity to franchise, or to figure out how to grow this small scale success into the, something bigger. So the setup is a lot of this kind of thing. Hey, here, this is an opportunity. Let's talk about this as a community. There's a lot of that in the setup. And then they have to figure out what that thing is that they're actually selling, or what is that unit that they're trying to scale up. What is the widget that we all are trying to sell when it comes to successful watershed management? And then you test it. Okay, do we have this right? And then go to the full scale. So there are some support systems here and adoption mechanisms. Many of these terms we're familiar with. We know that we need to incorporate those into our own efforts. So I'll just point those out. Learning systems, data systems, the infrastructure, the human capacity. Do you have the right people in place? Do they know what they need to know to be successful? Do we have that flexibility and sustainability built into the system, which takes leadership, communication, social networks, a culture of change. What Brent was saying before about, he had developed an internal culture and is sharing that with us that, hey, I want to take this on as a responsibility to get this done, and I want you to join me. It's that kind of attitude. And then a sense of urgency and persistence, which he was also exhibiting. All right. Any questions? Questions about that? Okay. Okay. So what's our scalable unit or what is a scalable unit? So this is language that I'm trying to figure out how to get out of, but for now, bear with me. It's it's really wonky. It's not just sort of. It's really wonky. But what I mean when I say scalable unit is the smallest administrative unit that includes key infrastructure, relationships, architecture, and other necessary elements of your theory of change. Okay, so we're just trying to put a name on this thing that we're trying to create. And so for us in watersheds, it's okay. I think there's a multi-scale nature which people have talked about. So I'm going to get into that in a minute, but I just want to demonstrate that example. Something else to keep in mind when we're talking about our theory of change in watershed management is some work that a woman named Lynn Ostrom did, Eleanor Ostrom, a Nobel Prize winning economist based in Indiana, actually. She's passed away now, but she did a lot of work on what we call common pool resources, and a resource that, without getting into the technical explanation of what that is, it's a resource that we all share in common that we can't completely limit access to, and we all use, right? So when managing common pool resources, there are 8 principles that stand out consistently across all of our efforts to manage. So water, fisheries, sometimes forest resources, those are examples of what common pool resources can be. We first have to define clear group boundaries. What is that area that we are trying to manage? Match the rules governing the use of common goods like water to local needs and conditions. So we've got to get that local scale right. And the cost of the rules, and if I'm going to apply these practices on my farm, that rule cost has to match the rule benefit in some way. We've got to get that balance right. Ensure those are affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. We rightly get pushback when that doesn't happen. Make sure the rulemaking rights of community members are respected by outside authorities. So really doing a better job at nesting those local conversations with the state conversations, with the multi-state big basin conversations. And I think we're doing a better job at that all the time. 5, develop a system carried out by community members for monitoring. So monitoring critical, you all know this, but having some ownership in like with farmer-led watershed councils, or getting the people that are owning and managing the land engaged in monitoring what's happening there. Using graduated sanctions for rule violators. So I don't know about you, but in Wisconsin, we have these graduated sanctions. Do we use them? Sometimes, but maybe not as often as we could. And this doesn't mean making somebody a bad person for something that's happened that's violating, but it means we're policing each other for the benefit of each other to try to do that rising tides lift all boats. Provide accessible low-cost means for dispute resolution, and then finally build responsibility for governing in these nested tiers, which I've already talked about. So she specifically talks about those nested tiers. Okay, so these are just, again, things to keep in mind, like is the system I'm building reflecting what we know works across systems globally? All right. Necessary elements for our theory of change for successful watershed management. So my colleagues and I, including some folks that are here in the room, got together, experts in this arena, and figured out, okay, what are we seeing that are these necessary elements across a number of states in the upper Midwest? And I'm going to talk about what people said the scalable unit was, a little bit about human capital, social capital, watershed financing systems, and policy and governance systems that we're seeing emerge. And we're early in this process, so stay tuned for more, but I'm giving you what we know so far. And we also are going to create a technology piece, but I don't have as much information on that right now, so I'm not going to cover that in today's presentation. All right, how am I doing on time? 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. Okay, so what people said was our scalable unit. What are we trying to build when we're building a successful watershed management system? And again, this is the lowest level of, thing that we need to create. So we need to have watershed planning and implementation considered in this model, right? We need a plan and we need a plan for implementing. This is not going to surprise you, but what we're seeing is that some states have some of these in place, and some states have others in place. Some watersheds incorporate some of these. And so what we'd like to do is create a common understanding of what all of those necessary elements are, and you can say, okay, these are the things that I have, and these are the things that I'm missing. So that's the idea. So we need a plan, and we need a way to implement. We need a foundational social network, and the social network needs to be inclusive, right? It needs to be all of those people that are necessary to get the job done in your particular watershed. It can't, you got to really think about that strategically when you're starting and as you're building these watershed projects. Social networks work most often at the HUC 12 scale in our region, though this may differ with different populations and different governance systems. So Nebraska, for example, they have a larger, their NRD system, their natural resource district, thank you, system, that's larger scale. They are less densely populated than we are, so that seems to work for them. Planning can occur at larger scales, creating efficiencies, and again, in our region, that HUC 810 seems to work mostly for us. So you can have planning at the HUC 8 level, but implementation, as you may know, that does not seem to work not only here, but across states in the upper Midwest. Okay, we need watershed leaders. We need watershed coordinators. So watershed leadership first. You need people that are willing to step up and say, yes, I am invested in this and I'm willing to do something different to help make it happen. Watershed coordinators are critical. That's just that is something that we cannot compromise on. We don't need a watershed coordinator in every HUC 12 across Iowa, but we do need a system for rotating, those folks through in a way that we can get full-scale coverage. And I'd say the same thing about Wisconsin or Minnesota. This is something that is a critical element, and we need to communicate that. People said we need system integrators or liaisons, people that are going to be bridgers and be the glue that holds that network together. And that might be a watershed coordinator. It may be another person or group of people. We need to professionalize watershed management. So those coordinators, are there any watershed coordinators in the room? All right, so you guys know, it's tough to stay in, we need watershed coordinators to be there developing those relationships over a long period of time. They need to be paid what they're worth. It's a complex job. They need career paths, maybe professional certification, those kinds of things that we need to be thinking about to professionalize watershed management. I mean, agronomy was not always the profession that it is. Name your, we need to think about how to do that for watershed management, including that providing for professional development and perhaps certification. All right, social capital. What people said was that we need to think about stakeholder readiness and engagement. So how many of you have participated in an RCPP project or an MRBI, MRBI project? Yep. So you know that if the ground is fertile starting out, if the social ground is fertile starting out, you can make a lot more progress than if that particular area is not ready to move when that money is available. So we've got to pay attention to that. Building trust in relationships is an important part. Active programs for social networking development. So we pay attention to how we do monitoring, right? How we do watershed monitoring, doing soil monitoring. We pay attention to all that. We have to pay the same attention to how we're structuring our social networks and how we structure community learning and decision making, and that people part of what we're doing in the watershed. Someone pointed out in Sean's presentation, I forget whether it was Sean or his co-presenter, we need agreed upon goals and managed expectations. So when you have those agreed upon goals, you can get further faster, and that's a social issue. It's not a biophysical or a technical issue. Broader regulations can be a catalyzing factor. So this question about do we need regulation? We don't see evidence that we need regulation, but we do see the value of broader regulation being a catalyzing factor. Whether it can be in the Chesapeake Bay, even, it can be a catalyzing factor. So it can help. It can help. Communication and coordination among state and federal agencies, that was specifically called out. So that looks like a little more micro than some of these things, but just to point, people said, hey, when IDOLs and NRCS are on the same page, it makes our job a lot easier, as an example. That's what came out. Okay, policy and governance systems. So this is more of a thought process change, which I think conservation infrastructure is in this same thought process change category. We need a one water approach to water management. We need to be thinking about water management, whether it's urban, rural, drinking water, surface water. We need to think about it as all connected and manage it in that way. Our systems are most often not designed to do that. So how do we step back from the systems that we currently have and, shift our mind and shift our, conservation, think about conservation infrastructure. We think about the water, our water systems as green or blue infrastructure that's moving from rural areas into urban areas and back into rural areas. If it's all connected, how do we manage things differently? Fostering collaboration then among different partners and different actors to get that done. And then this idea of nested watershed planning, monitoring and implementation systems. Again, specifically, HUC 8 planning, HUC 10-12 planning implementation, and having a statewide framework for getting that done. Providing accountability. And when I say accountability, as we've talked about earlier, I mean more than just regulation. So we need to set standards, goals, and timeframes. Standards, goals, timeframes. What people have said, in the people that we were talking to, is that we need numbers. It doesn't. People weren't willing to say that you need numeric nutrient criteria. That they didn't say you need numeric nutrients, but you need to have numbers somewhere, whether it's in shared goals for your state or it's in your state standards. Either way, you need numeric goals because it really facilitates communication and adaptation as you get new information. Let's see, nested goals and authority, I already talked about that. Maintaining adaptability. Again, if you have these numeric goals and you do put them in state standards, how do you give yourselves the flexibility to adapt as you learn? Providing transparent public outreach and feedback systems. Transparency, key word here. And then, of course, the measurement and monitoring in place at stages, so you can, setting milestones as well as goals, and then monitoring to see how you're doing when you meet those milestones. And again, you may be looking at this and say, you already have some of this in place in Iowa, and you do, and you may be looking at other things and saying, well, you know, maybe that's a place where we could raise the bar. All right, financing, just to fine tune that one water comment. So thinking about financial capital in a more of a networked fashion as opposed to a siloed fashion. So it's not, okay, government's funding this and the private sector is funding this, but let's look at what's the public good here, what's the private good, and structure our systems to pay for those services accordingly. Maintaining the balance in who pays and who benefits, and I'm sorry I missed Kathy Kling's presentation yesterday, where I understand she talked a little bit about this, but we do need more research on, okay, you know, who's benefiting in the investments that we're making? Is it a public benefit? Is it a private benefit? And therefore, who's paying? And how do we tailor those financial contributions accordingly? You all, you know, you just have some new capacity, I think, to use your revolving loan funds here in agricultural landscapes. So good for you as a model that I think the rest of us in the upper Midwest are going to be looking at. I'm going to talk a little bit about Wisconsin. We have watershed adaptive management. Pay for performance is another model, of course, that people are looking at. Market, we've talked about market-driven quite a bit. Sean covered quite a bit of that. And non-traditional government funding sources, like, again, Iowa has funding from HUD that looks at flood prevention as well as nutrient management. All right. I am going to just give you a couple of examples. So I didn't have any Iowa examples because you're here, and I wanted to give you a couple of examples from not here. So Wisconsin has our watershed adaptive management framework for point and non-point sources to work together. So we do have numeric criteria for phosphorus that the point sources need to meet, which has provided a regulatory cap for us that has been useful for moving progress. And what that's done is it's made it advantageous for our point sources to provide funding to our non-point sources because they can get the job done cheaper. The non-point sources can, like in our farms, can get the job done cheaper. The other interesting thing about the watershed adaptive management option is that it's not, we're not just meeting the criteria for credits. They need to meet nutrient criteria. So it really is like pay for performance, because what we're trying to do is get the water clean, not ratchet down necessarily with credits. So it's measuring what's happening in the water as the goal. I just included in these slides that later you're not supposed to be able to read this, but these are the differences between watershed adaptive management and tree. Okay, so you've got that, and you've got it here. Minnesota's One Watershed, One Plan talks a little bit about their systematic approach to cover the state with watershed plans, talks about planning scales, implementation scales, and their integrated approach and their stakeholder engagement approach to watershed management, and I gave you a link there. And the final example I want to just share with you, this is urban green infrastructure, but one of the interesting things they've done in Washington, D.C., which I recommend you take a look at, humongous financial challenge to manage stormwater volume. And so they do have regulations on stormwater volume, but what they did is they have developed this, it's a trading system, but it's all available online, so you can see what credits are going for and who's buying credits and where and how much. And they also, these credits, so what our developers like about this system is they have addressed the maintenance issue. So you know, in agricultural systems, we need to figure out how to maintain those practices over the long term. There's a public benefit for that, as well as sometimes a private benefit. And they have these, the maintenance for these practices goes along with the property eventually. So the developer fee upfront is lower, and the cost is spread out over time. So just another example for you to think about and how this might relate to how we get to scale. So that's what I have, and thanks very much for your time.